This is the second passage. It says it's adapted from Jennifer Groh, Making Space, How the Brain Knows Where Things Are, written in 2014. So the first paragraph opens up by saying that there's an overlap between the areas of the brain responsible for cognition, that means thinking, and areas of the brain responsible for sensory and motor processing. What does that mean? It says in line 6, perhaps thinking also involves activating some subset of sensory and motor pathways of the brain. And then they give this example: when you sit on a couch, you're also probably thinking about the experience visually, what it's like touch, by smell, by sound. And so she summarizes this by saying the theory is that thought might involve simulating the activity patterns in our sensory and motor areas of the brain, and that's called grounded or embodied cognition. So the first paragraph basically gives you an overall description of what the theory is with one example. Moving down to the second paragraph, it looks like she's going to start talking about some evidence for this view. And again, red here is really just a restatement of the actual theory. How you respond to something depends on otherwise irrelevant features of the sensory stimulus. But interestingly, she's going to focus on space. And then from line 21, she introduces one study done by Mike Tucker and Rob Ellis. And what it involves is, in line 26, subjects basically indicate whether these pans or spatulas are right side up or upside down by pressing a button. And one button was placed near the subject's left hand and the other near the right hand. Moving into the third paragraph, she tells us what the purpose of it was, and it says in line 34, Tucker and Ellis were not particularly interested in the upright inverted choices, but whether the subjects would respond faster when they had to press the button with the hand on the same side as the handle, or obviously versus the opposite side. So this is relatively common for psychology or behavioral experiments. In other words, you get the people in the experiment to think that you're focusing on one thing when you're secretly measuring another. This way, their thoughts about it are not going to interfere with the results. So what were the results? They were in line 42. Tucker and Ellis found that when the handle on the frying pan was on the left, responses involving the left hand were faster, line 45, than those involving the right. They also made fewer errors. And then interestingly, in line 47, it says when the objects were mirror reversed, the pattern was reversed as well, indicating that it was not simply a matter of being faster or more accurate with one hand than the other. So again, what they're doing is they're eliminating confounding factors, meaning to say that maybe if you're right-handed, you'll respond faster if the button is on the right, or if you're left-handed, same thing. In the next paragraph from lines 52, what she's going to do is she says another classic illustration. So obviously that's another experiment. This was done by Roger Shepard and Jacqueline Metzler. In this experiment, they basically had drawings of blocks, and it was the same block or different blocks taken from a different viewpoint. And then people basically had to decide whether it was the same or different blocks. The results were, in line 61, that how long it took the subjects to make the judgment about whether the block was the same or not varied proportionally to the amount of rotation that would have been needed to bring the two objects into alignment. So basically what that means is that the longer it took them to mentally rotate the objects, the longer it took them to make a decision. And then in the last paragraph, she talks about some implications. She says both of these experiments suggest that mental reasoning can show signatures of real-world spatial constraints. What does she mean? The frying pan experiment, there's no reason for the side of the handle to affect responses, yet it did in terms of their speed. And then in the second case, there's no physical object to be actually turned, but she's saying the amount of time required to perform the task does depend on how much rotation there is. As far as the graph goes, I generally don't look at them until I see the question, just because there's typically one, maybe two max questions, and I don't want to waste my time looking at the graph until I actually see the question about it. So what I recommend for these passages is once you're done reading it or while you're reading it, just take like 30 seconds to kind of make notes about what each paragraph is. This way, when you look back at the passage, you can quickly find the information, given that it's now fresh in your mind. So we said the first paragraph is basically about the theory. And then right here is where the theory is stated in the most formal way. The next paragraph talks about the first experiment, so we'll call that experiment 1. And again, if you wanted to write in line 19, this is just a restatement of the theory. Lines 36 to 38 were basically the goals, what they were trying to figure out in the experiment. And then starting in lines 43, these were the results of the first experiment. Lines 48, we basically said we're eliminating confounding factors, things that'll confuse the results. Line 52 is experiment 2. And the results are in lines 60 and beyond. The last paragraph are basically, we'll call them implications. These are things, as they say, that the studies suggest, both in the first experiment and the second experiment. Question 11. Which choice best represents the overall structure of the passage? So if you remember from our outline, it's basically a theory is discussed, there are 2 experiments, and then there are some implications of those experiments. So we're looking for something like that. Choice A, a hypothesis is put forth, an experiment testing that hypothesis is outlined, and an explanation for that experiment is offered. So one thing that's off is that there are actually 2 experiments. And the other thing is that the difference between a theory and a hypothesis is a guess about the results of a specific experiment. A theory is more like a more general explanation of how something works, why something happens. So A doesn't really seem to be the answer. Choice B, a theory is described, studies exploring that theory are recounted, that means like retold, gone through, and the significance, the importance of the results is suggested. So that does seem to work. We'll keep it. Choice C, a generalization is presented, 2 examples are contrasted, and a revision is provided. So again, we were dealing more with a theory, not so much a generalization. A generalization is more like a summary of a lot of separate ideas or thoughts or data points. 2 examples is not exactly accurate because what we read were 2 experiments. They also were not really contrasted. The experiments kind of demonstrated the same thing, albeit in different ways. Finally, there was no revision of the generalization. By the end of the passage, the theory actually still held true. There were just some implications about what it suggested. So C is definitely not the answer. D, a theory is introduced. That's right. Potential criticism of that theory is considered and a rebuttal is presented. So we really didn't hear any criticisms of the theory, and a rebuttal would be a counter argument, in this case arguing for the theory. Both of those are not present, and so D is out and B is the best answer. Question 12. Based on the passage, how would the author most likely respond to another scientist's claim that the theory of embodied cognition cannot account for thoughts regarding abstract concepts such as peace and honesty? So let's go back to the passage and quickly look over what the theory was. The theory is that thought might involve simulating the activity of patterns in our sensory and motor areas of the brain, and particularly remember that they focused only on space. So in general, I think that the author would probably agree that that is really just not covered under the experiment. Maybe they would say, oh, let's try to extend it further, but let's look through the answer choices. Choice A, by arguing that the scientist has not fully considered the mechanics of the theory of embodied cognition. Again, I don't really know what they mean by the mechanics of the theory, but like we said, the theory doesn't really cover these things, so A is probably not going to work. B, by asserting that thoughts about abstract concepts are less common than thoughts about concrete objects. Again, how common people think about abstract versus concrete objects has nothing to do with the theory. The theory is basically saying that when we think of things, we actually employ other senses, such as our spatial thoughts. C, by suggesting that the theory of embodied cognition should be tested under different experimental cognitions. This is possibly true, but again, remember the theory doesn't really cover these concepts, so we'll keep it, but it doesn't seem the best. D, by conceding that the theory of embodied cognition may not account for all aspects of thought. From what we said, this seems to be the most reasonable answer because we're really only dealing with sensory, in this case, and motor areas of the brain. So we'll go with D, and that's the answer. Number 13, according to the passage, embodied cognition is the theory that thought, So going back to the passage, remember the theories in lines 12 to 15. Thought might involve simulating the activity patterns in our sensory and motor areas of the brain, and in this particular case, we're focusing on space. So let's go through the answers. Emerges from reactions to powerful events. Again, no mention of powerful events, so A is out. Can be used to improve various physiological functions, possibly, but again, nothing mentioned about that. C, may involve activation of signals that also control the body. This is a possibility because look at what they're doing. They're taking the theory that thought involves stimulating patterns in the sensory and motor areas of the brain, and then they're renaming sensory and motor areas as control of the body. So this is a common strategy that the SAT will do when they're making answer choices. In order for it to be objective, they're simply rephrasing something that is there in the passage. So we'll keep C. D, demands conscious mental effort from the thinker. Possibly, but nothing really mentioned about that in the actual theory. So C seems like our best bet, and we'll go with that. Question 14. As used in line 20, interest most nearly means. Start from line 18. Remember, the idea is that how you respond to something depends upon otherwise irrelevant features of the sensory stimulus. So what are these irrelevant features? What they mentioned before: visual, tactile, auditory, olfactory, and motor responses. But look what the next sentence says. And of particular interest here, these seemingly irrelevant features often involve space. So they're telling you that we can actually generalize these features, or these features do have a pattern. So what do they mean by particular interest? Yes, it's interesting in itself, but what they really are saying is of particular relevance, because it helps us to understand, of particular maybe prominence, or you could even say of particular note, but that's probably not really explaining exactly what they mean. So looking back at the answer choices, let's go through them. Choice A, of particular sympathy, doesn't make sense because sympathy is being able to understand and feel the emotions of others. Of particular importance, that does seem to work because it is an important observation about those irrelevant details. Of particular responsibility doesn't really make sense because the facts themselves are not responsible. Neither are really we responsible for that. Of particular attention, this one I'd say is okay. It's really just awkwardly phrased and not idiomatic. If you say of particular attention and you were thinking, oh, this is something we should pay attention to, I would say, yeah, logically you're absolutely right, but B is still the best choice. Question 15. When the author refers to certain studies as classic, in line 21 and 52, she most nearly means that the studies are, so let's take a look at them. Line 21, in one classic study, that was the one with Mike Tucker and Rob Ellis. Another classic illustration of a seemingly unnecessary connection comes from mental rotation experiments, and your clue is really in line 55, in one early study. So we know that these things had been done some time ago, and let's go with that. Choice A, simple and understated in their design. Again, she doesn't really criticize the studies. There's nothing really negative that that is talked about in the passage, so probably not. B, based upon antiquated ways of thinking. Antiquated means outdated, old-fashioned. Again, this is kind of a negative word, but she doesn't really mean anything negative by classic. Choice C, frequently performed by other researchers. Possibly, but there's no indication about that. Classic studies have been definitely repeated because people want to know if they're valid, but again, it doesn't seem likely. D, long established and well regarded. This seems like the most likely answer because she is using them to back up her theory, and there's really no question of them, and we know that they're early, so D is the answer. Questions 16 and 17 should be done together, but let's go through 16. Based on the passage, which statement regarding the subjects in Tucker and Ellis's experiment can most reasonably be inferred? So remember, Tucker and Ellis's experiment was the first one. So it pays to quickly go through the answer choices before you look at the evidence. Choice A, they were unaware of the true focus of the study. That was true because if you remember, it had said secretly they were testing whether their left hand or right hand was faster based on the orientation of the pots as opposed to just guessing up and down. So for this one, we'll keep. If you don't remember that, then that's okay. Just wait until we look at the evidence. B, they have been carefully selected based on their backgrounds. Again, don't recall anything about that. C, they frequently use the utensils in the photographs. Don't really recall any comments about that. D, they had unusually well-developed spatial skills. Also don't really recall anything about that, but since we're talking about spatial skills, just keep an eye on it. So question 17, now this is where we go through the evidence. Which choice best provides the evidence to the previous question? Choice A, lines 21 to 24. In one classic study, Mike Tucker and Rob Ellis at the University of Plymouth asked subjects to judge whether the items were upside down or right side up. Again, really no comment about the subjects other than what they were supposed to do. Doesn't really match up with any of our answers. So I'll cross out choice A. Choice B, lines 24 to 26. The stimuli consisted of photographs of common household objects like frying pans or spatulas. So again, that just describes the experiment. No comment about the subjects, so we'll cross that out. C, 26 to 28. Subjects were to indicate their choice by pressing a designated button. One button for upright and the other for upside down. So this does talk about the subjects. Does it say anything that was mentioned in the previous answer choices? Let's check. So again, nothing about how they were selected, nothing about the utensils they used, and nothing saying that they had unusually well-developed spatial skills. So choice C seems unlikely. Choice D, 34 to 38. 34 says, secretly Tucker and Ellis were not particularly interested in the upright inverted choices, but whether the subjects would respond faster when they had to press the button with the hand on the same side as the handle. So again, that does back up choice A because it says they were unaware of the true focus of the study. And so we'll go to choice D. So questions 18 and 19 should be done together. Based on the passage, could the likelihood that most participants in Tucker and Ellis' study write with their right hands be used as an effective challenge to their conclusions? So the answer is likely no, because if you remember, they did account for that by switching the photographs. Regardless, let's go through the answer choices real quickly before we look at the evidence. Choice A, yes, because right-handed people would naturally be able to grasp objects with their right hand more quickly than their left. This might be true in fact, but because of the fact that they did account for that, it's not likely going to be the answer. B, yes, because right-handed people would be able to visualize objects on their right more clearly than those on their left. This is even less likely to be the answer because nothing in the passage suggested that left-handed or right-handed people were able to visualize better. So we'll keep that out. C, no, because the researchers' study design had successfully ruled out the possibility that being right-handed would be a factor in the results. Again, this does seem like the answer. We'll hold on to it. D, no, because the researchers switched the photographs shown based on whether participants were right or left-handed. So this is not actually what they did, and we'll see that as we look back at the passage. So going to 19, let's go through the evidence. Choice A, lines 29 to 33. 29, one button was placed near the subject's left hand and the other near the right hand, a detail we wouldn't normally consider to be important, but that was essential. No indication here that right-handed people or left-handed people were favored or set up differently, so this is not likely the answer. Choice B, lines 38 to 42. All the objects had handles and were photographed in multiple orientations, upright with the handle on either the left or the right, and inverted with the handle on either the left or the right. Again, the same thing here. There's no favoritism to left-handed or right-handed people, and they were set up exactly the same way, so not likely the answer. We'll cross out choice B. Choice C, lines 42 to 45. Tucker and Ellis found that when the handle on the frying pan was on the left, responses involving the left hand were indeed faster than those involving the right. No mention in this choice about whether the people were indeed left-handed or right-handed. So choice D, lines 47 to 51. When the objects were mirror reversed, the response pattern reversed as well, indicating that it was not simply a matter of being faster or more accurate with one hand than the other. So these two lines right there do back up our answer, which was, again, choice C. The design had successfully ruled out the possibility that being right-handed or left-handed for that matter was a factor in the results because they evenly accounted for both. So choice D is the answer. Question 20. Based on the table, which statement best represents the findings about the mean response times? So now it's actually time to look at the table. Let's get a sense of what it says before we consider any of the answer choices. So it says effective object orientation and response hand on response time. So in the first column, we have the handle. The second column, we have the hand. And then in the last column, we have the time. What we're going to notice is that when the handle and the hand were the same, either left and left or right and right, the response time was particularly lower in the 620s. On the other hand, when the handle and the hand were opposite, either left and right or right and left, the response times were particularly higher in the 630s. And that basically backs up what we read in the passage. Choice A, subjects responded slowest when presented with objects with handles on the left for both response hands. So remember, that's actually not true because the slowest was not when the handles were on the left for both hands. That would be considering these two cases. The slowest were when there was a mismatch between the two. So we'll cross out choice A. Choice B, subjects responded slowest when presented with objects with handles on the right for both response hands. This is basically saying the same as choice A, just opposite side, not true. C, subjects responded fastest when presented with objects with handles on the opposite side from their response hand for both object handle orientations. So again, this is actually the opposite because when they were on opposite sides, the responses were in fact the longest. So not true. Choice D, subjects responded fastest when presented with objects with handles on the same side as their response hand for both object handle orientations. Yes, that's true based on what we said, and so D is the answer. Question 21. Based on the passage, how would an advocate, that means someone who supports the theory of embodied cognition, most likely explain the results presented in the table? So again, going back to the theory just in general, it's that thought might involve simulating the activity patterns in our sensory and motor areas of the brain, particularly related to space. So let's go through the answer choices. Choice A, when the response hand is on the same side as the object handle, the objects in the photographs are easier to recognize. So if this were true, it would back up the data that when they're on the same side, the response times are lower. However, the theory is not saying that the objects are easier to recognize. Rather, what the theory is saying is that there is a certain amount of mental rotation that needs to be going on. Particularly if you look at lines 61, they found that how long it took the subjects to make the judgment varied proportionately with the amount of rotation that would have been needed to bring those two objects into alignment had they been real. So it's not the fact that they're easier to recognize, it's the fact that there was less mental rotation that had to go on. So choice A is out. B, when the response hand is on the same side as the object handle, sensory areas activate more slowly and deliberately. Well, if this were true that they acted more slowly, you would expect the results to show that when the hand is on the same side as the handle, that the times would increase, but that's actually not true, and it goes against the theory. C, when the response hand is on the side that is opposite the object handle, the brain must take longer to adjust the mental visualization. So C seems to be correct based on the lines that we pointed out for choice A. It's just basically saying it in the negative sense, so we'll keep that for now. D, when the response hand is on the side that is opposite to the object handle, the brain is able to picture more sharply the object to be grasped. Again, this is kind of like choice B, because if this were true, you would expect that when the hand and the handle are on opposite sides, the time should be less if the brain is able to picture the object more sharply, yet the times are increased. So this goes against the theory and against the data. So we're left with choice C, which is the answer.